Good morning, everybody. This is Michelle, your host here. It's great to have so many of you joining us. I know some of you are struggling a little bit with sound. If ever it drops off for you, just check your Communicate tab. It's at the top of your screen if you're on a laptop or a PC, and that way you'll be able to check your audio source is correct in your audio settings. We have webinar CIPD, Mark and Nantha, in the background, so they'll be able to give you information in the chat box. If you're struggling to find the chat box, then you'll need to scroll to the bottom of your screen and you'll be able to see a speech bubble. And on that speech bubble, if you click that, you'll be able to join in the chat. Now, do remember when you join in the chat to put to all participants so that you can share your thoughts and your questions with everybody on the webinar today. We've already got 245 people and the number is going up as the time is just at 10 o'clock. Now, I'm going to be in the background gathering all of your questions and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. So please do pop your questions and thoughts in that space right there, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. We've got our experts today with you talking about Brexit's immigration policy, and we've got Ian Robinson from Fragomen, who are immigration experts, and we've got Gerwyn Davies, our own CIPD researcher, into this very topic. So I'm going to hand over to them, but do keep in touch with me in the chat if you've got any concerns about sound or questions or anything like that. I'm here to help you today. Thank you. Over to Gerwyn.
Thank you, Michelle. So just to start again, for those who didn't hear that, we're really pleased to be running this webinar, given its huge significance to the people management profession. And that importance has really been brought home to us during the summer in the research that we've done, that Ian has been involved in, which has included 6 focus groups and a survey, which I'll come on to. And it's really brought home 2 key conclusions that have really emerged from that research. One is that many of you understandably feel very concerned and daunted by the introduction of migration restrictions, especially those who have little or no experience of using the current points-based system for non-EU citizens. And those concerns range from the costs that some of you are alarmed by, understandably, and also the resource and capability implications that the restrictions will have. And some of you, understandably, also feel quite confused by, and not least by the political uncertainty and the twists and turns that are being generated. And very recently, we've seen the new administration come in and ask the Migration Advisory Committee to look at the Australian points-based system more closely, to look at the concept of introducing regional salary thresholds, as well as taking another look at the minimum salary threshold. So we're keeping a close eye on it, but it is quite exhausting having to do so. And it's easy to see why so many organizations, according to our research, are not putting in place measures in anticipation of the migration restrictions and restricting all their efforts to retaining EU citizens and the EU settlement scheme. But before we go into the detail, we thought that we would just highlight some of our achievements in the policy space. You'll see that we've been particularly busy over the last couple of years and had a huge amount of impact through the media in our Facing the Future report, which is our first attempt at producing a blueprint for what the government should do in its post-Brexit immigration policy. And its influence was reflected by the fact that the CIPD was the most quoted organisation out of the 450 plus organisations that submitted evidence to the MAC report, whose recommendations the government adopted in its white paper. Additionally, we've been very vocal and visible in Westminster and Whitehall. There are a couple of examples there, as well as through our membership of the Employers Forum, which the Home Office run, which is quite a select group of bodies. In addition, we have produced 2 outputs which look at practice in terms of how organizations can prepare through workforce planning. So we've got some advice there, for instance, on how you can scenario plan, how to audit your workforce sensitively, which is clearly applicable to those organizations that employ a particularly high proportion of EU nationals in certain occupations, and there's a broader piece on continuity planning for HR, which is our most recent output. So I would urge you to take a look at that. And what is, of course, all underlines is that this is incredibly important, not least because we know that there are incredibly low levels of awareness of the migration restriction proposals. 58% say that they've never heard of it or have heard of it but know nothing about it, which really does highlight the significance of this webinar and why what Ian is about to tell you is so important. So over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Gerwyn, for the introduction. So as we've heard, I'm Ian Robinson. I'm a partner with Fragomen, an immigration law firm. At Fragomen, I've been with the firm for 8 years, and for the first 5 years, I spent my time pretty much advising companies on how to bring non-European workers to the UK where they were needed to fill skills gaps, bring leadership or company experience. Actually, though, for the last 3 years, the vast majority of my time has been spent talking about Brexit. And Brexit it's a difficult issue. It's very clear that Brexit poses certain risks that I'll come to, but for a large portion of the last 3 years, there has been very little law to advise clients on, which is never a comfortable place for a law firm. But actually, despite all of that uncertainty, despite the political volatility and the changes in dates, there is a very clear route through to managing the risks of Brexit and making sure that you're on the front foot in your people functions, but also making sure that the business knows what the risks are and how they can be mitigated and the contingencies that can be put in place. And I'm going to talk about that. In terms of the risk, I see 3 broad risk areas. The first is employee welfare, and that's about retention and recruitment. The next is about the operations of your business and making sure that your existing employees can continue to work and operate in the UK where they are European, but also, and I will cover this during the presentation, also British employees in Europe, where actually, despite Brexit being an issue that came from the UK, the risks will most keenly manifest themselves in the short term in Europe for people. And then the final risk to consider is the future of UK immigration and what that will mean to your access to the skills and labour that you need to run your business in the UK, and then planning to mitigate those risks one way or another. So I'm going to talk about 4 things. First will be about the arrangements in place, whether or not there is a deal for UK nationals in Europe and for British people here. I'm going to explain the European settlement scheme that is in place for your UK employees who are from the European Union, the EEA, or from Switzerland. And throughout the presentation, I'll simply refer to them as European employees. And then I'm going to talk about the new immigration system and what you can do there. There will be a lot of detail, a lot of content at least, even though I can't cover all of the detail. But it's got to be practical, so I'll finish a plan, a simple plan that you can put into place to just manage all of this. Before we go to that plan, it's impossible not to avoid the politics of Brexit, and it's really volatile and uncertain. I think if I get home one more night and sit looking at the BBC to see what's happened during dinner, that I may need to find a new dinner table to eat at. But it seems to be changing constantly. And one of 4 things can happen right now politically. Either a deal is agreed and we leave the European Union in a reasonably settled way at the end of October, or Brexit is delayed, most likely until the end of January, but it does feel like it could be going on and on for quite some time. We may have no deal, although legally that would be very difficult for this October, or we could have a second referendum and potentially no deal. No Brexit. Actually, though, unless Brexit is cancelled altogether, the risks are the same, your plan is the same, the only thing that changes is the date. So I joked with Gerwyn yesterday that the slide pack I speak to almost is the slide pack I've been using for about 2 years and all I change are the dates and just make it look a little bit nicer as we go along. The plan is pretty clear, so I'll talk to what that is. Before we get there, so what do we need to think about in terms of the plan and when things can happen? So my first piece of advice when I talk to clients is, it is actually possible to plan for this, even though there's all this uncertainty. We do know some key dates, and we can use those key dates in order to plan your communications and the plan that you can put into place. So we know that the referendum happened on the 23rd of June 3 years ago. There have been various steps since, the biggest recently being either Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister in July or Boris Johnson deciding that he would prorogue Parliament back in August. The next big step could be if an election is called for next month, although that looks increasingly unlikely. So it's likely to be the 31st of October deadline that Boris Johnson has set to leave the European Union, assuming that it isn't delayed. If we assume it were to happen, from there we go through until the end of December 2020. Now, for the UK, whether or not there is a deal, very little will change in terms of accessing the legalities of accessing European workers until the end of 2020. Even if there is no deal, you will be able to access them, although it may become a little bit harder to convince them to come over, and you will need to think about how long they will be able to stay for. And I'll explain what that means in practice. If there is a deal, then free movement continues. There is no change whatsoever. People coming over from Europe will experience exactly the same rights up until the end of October, the end of December 2020, where they're coming in. We then have a new immigration system on the 1st of January 2021, and you need to be preparing for that. And then the deadline for applications under the settlement scheme that I will talk about will be the end of June 2021. So long as there's a deal. Otherwise, it would have been at the end of December 2020. Now, these dates can shift, but as central planning assumptions, they work quite well when you're thinking about communications and how to educate the business and how to move people. Before we get to that, though, so what does it mean if a deal is agreed? So I'm going to talk a lot about the process for the UK, largely because the process for people who need to confirm their status in Europe isn't quite set yet. But the high-level policy, if there is a deal, is broadly the same in Europe and in the UK. So we will leave the UK on an agreed date. If we have a Brexit with a deal, then unless there is another delay, a transition period will be in place until the end of December 2020, during which time European nationals will continue to be able to come to the UK and will retain their full free movement rights. Anybody who ends before the end of that transition period, again likely to finish at the end of December 2020, will be able to make an application under the EU settlement scheme that I'll talk about, and then we'll have a deadline of 30th of June 2021 to make that application. Really importantly, Irish nationals do not need to make an application under the scheme, just as British nationals in Ireland won't need to. That's because of our much deeper historical and cultural relationship. But if you are Irish and you have a non-European partner, so a partner from Hong Kong or a partner from Australia, then they will need to make an application, or probably will. And in those circumstances, it probably makes sense for you as the Irish national to apply, just so that the Home Office already know you before the application of your partner goes in. You'll find that it goes an awful lot quicker. So when those applications go in, they will typically be from European nationals. About 1 million have been put through so far and have been granted. There is some confusion over people who believe that they qualify for settled status but are getting pre-settled status, but I'll say a few words later about how you can reduce those risks for employees. The application goes in, and where a person has 5 years residence in the UK, they will qualify for settled status. That's a right to stay here permanently. They will only be refused, and they will only lose that right if they are a serious foreign criminal, and that will typically mean having spent a year or more in prison, but it can be even longer length of time or even more serious criminality if they have a long history here, family ties and so on. Where a person does not have 5 years residence, they will get pre-settled status, and that will mean that they can stay here before moving to full settled status at the 5-year residency mark. The application is made through an app and then online, and it is really straightforward. None of your employees should worry about making the application, and there are lots of resources out there to help them. It will sound a bit counterintuitive for a partner in a law firm to say this, but they almost certainly do not need to pay a lawyer to make the application with them. If they're at all uncertain or anxious, they should think about it. They must read the guidance and so on, but it's pretty intuitive. We're putting them through in 10 or 12 minutes. Most people will put them through in 15 or 20 minutes. It need not be that hard. If there are any issues, the Home Office will contact a person 3 times by phone, email or by letter to ask them questions, and the system's working pretty well. Now, for British people in Europe, the scheme, the overall shape of the scheme, the 5 years residence for permanent residents and under 5 for a bridging permission, will be the same. The process will change. It will probably be pretty paper-based in most countries, but the entitlement will be there if there is a deal. We don't know exactly how it will work country by country because they haven't published that yet, but we imagine it will be very similar to where a British person or any European national moves into a new member state and needs to register with local authorities, the town hall or similar. We think it will be pretty similar. That assumes that there is a deal. If there is no deal, then the first thing is that whereas if there is a deal, the EU settlement scheme is available to anybody who enters before the end of 2020. If there is no deal, it will be available to anyone who enters before Brexit. Then, for European people coming to the UK between Brexit and the new immigration system starting on the 1st of January 2021, they will apply under what's called the European Temporary Leave to Remain scheme, if they intend to stay beyond the beginning of January 2021. What that will mean is, again, an application most likely via an app and online, most likely pretty straightforward, and they will be granted 3 years stay. They will only need to make the application if they plan to stay from 2021 onwards. If they're only coming in for a few weeks or a few months and won't stay beyond that, they won't need to. But if they do, they will get 3 years stay. And at the end of the 3 years, they will be able to move into a new visa category if they qualify. Who will qualify is not entirely certain, but we imagine that if a person is in a job that's considered to be skilled at level or above, and I'll explain which jobs they are later, then they will be fine. We also assume that if people are not in such a skilled job, they will be limited to 3 years stay. So really, really importantly, your recruiters need to know that people they're bringing in from Europe may be limited to 3 years if they are in lower skilled jobs, and they need to manage those expectations. They also need to be careful about saying too much. They can't give legal advice on immigration unless they are fully qualified, but they need to make sure that people come with their eyes open. And there are various resources out there to explain how this works. There was talk about 4 or 5 weeks ago that the Home Secretary would end free movement straight away, and we have had a question about this in advance, that she would end free movement straight away, straight after Brexit. That was, Gerwyn and I talked about this at the time, that was never going to be legally or practically possible. The Home Office have since moved away from that and are not taking that line. So if you're worried about that particular policy, you don't need to, but you do need to understand, and for the business and recruiters to understand that irrespective, some people may be limited to 3 years stay.
Ian, can I just ask a quick question? So on European temporary leave, if we strike a deal with the EU ahead of the 31st October, then European temporary leave will kick in. What happens if there's an extension?
Yeah. So if we do manage to strike a deal, actually European temporary leave to remain should never exist, and free movement will continue until the end of December 2020, and you will never need to worry about, if there is a deal, telling people entering before 2021 that they will be limited to 3 years. However, if Brexit is extended, and we were talking about this in the room earlier, and My gut feeling is that it probably will be, but of course I know as much or as little as anybody else. If Brexit is extended, what I expect to happen is that the deadline, the cut-off for free movement may also be extended beyond the beginning of January 2021. And with it, European temporary leave to remain would then only come in if there is a no deal after the extension and up until free movement is deemed to have ended. For British people in Europe, this is where I spend most of my time talking to clients. Actually, even though I practice in the UK, the biggest risk of a no deal is for British people in Europe, and I put these people in three buckets. Firstly, if you are British and already living in Europe, if there is a no deal, you will need to register your stay. And I'll show you a heat map in a second that sets out how long people have got. But in Austria, for instance, it will be, Austria and Lithuania, it will be 6 or 9 months. Some countries are offering 3 years. Most countries are in between the two. People need to know that they need to register in that window, how long they've got and how to do it. That will be a logistical challenge, probably made harder by the fact that most employees don't routinely collect nationality of employees, and you may not know who your British people are in Europe. You really ought to, if you're recruiting and employing British people in Europe, begin now to work out who they are so that you can communicate with the employees already out there and make sure that they know they need to register. Then you're going to have people who need to go to Europe go to Europe from Britain after Brexit. They will need a work permit. A work permit in the UK, Gerwyn and I complain about the process every now and again. Trust me, it can be an awful lot harder to get a work permit in Europe, particularly if you're going to a civil law country where lots of documents need to be certified. If you're going to Italy, where it's going to take 6 to 9 months. If you're going to the Czech Republic, where you need a degree certificate to be nostrified, a word that I didn't know existed until I got clients in the Czech Republic. It's really complicated. It takes a long time. If you can move people before a no-deal Brexit, brilliant. If it's not possible, make sure recruiters and the business know that they need to be thinking now about how hard it will be, the documents that will be needed, and how long it will take. Then you've got business visitors, which I'll park for now and come to when we get to the slide, but that's another layer of complexity. Just skipping through, and the slides will be circulated, of course. You can see here that in Europe, this heat map shows the patchwork of periods that people will have, the grace periods that people will have to register, where they are British people in Europe, and how long they'll have. It's different in different countries. Familiarise yourself with this if you have European operations and UK nationals out there. And likewise, this heat map shows you how complex it can be to land people relative one country to the next in Europe. If you're sending them to Germany, if you're sending them to the Netherlands, to Estonia, fairly straightforward. If you're going to be sending them to Romania, Bulgaria, to Italy, even Ireland can be pretty tough at times. Then make sure that you are planning in advance. And then we've got a few questions which Gerwyn, if you could take a look at as I just covered the final slide in this section, and we can come to those. But the final part is about business travel. And business travel, right now, I was in Brussels a fortnight ago in Prague last week, and I just jump on a plane, get off, wander through and do what I like at the moment. After a no-deal Brexit, when free movement ends pretty much straight away in all European countries for UK nationals, if I'm going to be working, even if it's for a few days, I'll need a work permit, and that can be complicated. If I'm going to be having business meetings, that's probably going to be fine. But if I'm going to be training people, then generally in Europe that's okay if they're internal. But in France, I need a tripartite agreement. In Croatia, it can be pretty complicated. In Prague last week, I was speaking at a conference. Okay, in most European countries, but if I was doing it in Bulgaria once I lost my free movement rights, I would possibly need a work permit. Make sure you know what your people do when they go and visit their colleagues or clients in Europe, and that they know whether or not they would need a work permit. And trust me, if they are doing anything that looks like productive work, they're probably going to need one. Checking your emails, logging on is normally okay, but more than that can get complicated. For business travellers in the UK, Europeans coming over here, even if there is a no deal, it's still pretty straightforward up until the end of 2020. Very little will change, and they will be able to come in and do what they need to until the end of 2020 without applying for European temporary leave to remain. But beyond that, if they are going to be doing work again, even if it's only for a week, they're going to need to get a work permit. We have the problem when people are coming over for site visits that extend to put in a spade in the ground and actually doing work, sometimes maintaining equipment that wasn't sold by your company and so on.
Ian, just a couple of questions that have come through. If an EU national has already been granted settlement status and there is no deal, would this then be revoked and replaced by the 3-year limit?
No, it wouldn't. So if they have come over before Brexit and they are living here, then they can qualify for pre-settle status and settle status for their own sanity. I'm recommending that they apply for that now and don't wait until after a no-deal Brexit. But they won't need to reapply under ETLR. One tip that we give to our clients is if you can bring people in before the end of October, although it looks like a no deal is off the table, it's not entirely possible. If you know that they're due to start work later this year or early next, try and get them in before the end of October, and then they can benefit from settled status, and it will be more generous. Pre-settled status as well. If you can't, then legally speaking, they could come in for a short period, apply for pre-settled status, and then go home and come back after the no-deal Brexit. But do get some legal advice on that, because the timing and what it would mean for their residents if they end up with extended absences outside of the UK becomes complicated. And they will need, I'm not covering absences here, it's very technical, but they will need to understand that. So that was the deal and no deal, what's happening. I'm now going to quickly scoot through the settlement scheme before talking about right to work and then the new immigration system. What I would say about the settlement scheme, I've covered this already, but your employees need to know that it exists, that it's open, and that they should make an application if they are European or the family member of a European and in the UK, but they should not be intimidated by it. I'll talk at the end about the sort of support that you can provide to them to help them with the applications, but in principle and for the vast majority of people, it's pretty straightforward. You download an app onto an Android phone. The app is only available on Android at the moment, but the Home Office have said that at some point mid-autumn this year, so not too far away, it will be available on iPhones. You open the app and pass it over your biometric-enabled passport. It uploads your biometric details, it uploads your personal details so that you don't make an error when you're typing your name or passport number in. You then take a selfie. Really importantly, it may sound silly, but really importantly, make sure they know that selfie will stay for a good amount of time. So they might want to dress smart, do their hair, and so on. And then they scan their face. And the scanning of the face, if they have photosensitive epilepsy or similar, they need to be a little bit careful with this and consider whether or not it's right for them. But it's basically light flashing that has the effect of making sure that the face it's scanning is a real person and not a photo of a face. And in doing so, they confirm that Gerwyn Davies is in fact the Gerwyn Davies stood in front of them and in the passport. They then move you to your browser, you answer a few questions, you put in your national insurance number, you confirm that you do not have a history of criminality or of being a security threat in various ways. And then it checks your NI number and details against HMRC and benefits records. And if the system can see that you've been in the UK for 5 years, it asks you to confirm that, and then moves you through to be considered for pre-settle status, which is essentially a check against the police national computer. And you get your decision in, at the moment, a week, sometimes a little bit longer. I've known them to come through in 15 minutes, so really quick, but it doesn't take too long. If it doesn't know that you've been here for 5 years and you haven't been, you say, yes, that's right, and it pushes you through for pre-settled status. Again, that will take about a week or 2 weeks to come through. If it says, we think you've been here for 2 years, but you know that you've been here for 5 years, you just haven't been paying tax because you've been studying, for instance, you can photograph on your phone and upload certain evidence, which I'll come to in a second. If in providing the evidence, if you provide something inappropriate, so if I sent in a letter from my mum, for instance, that wouldn't be acceptable, but they would ring or email me to get more information and guide me as to what is acceptable. There have been people who believe that they're entitled to full settled status, so full permanent residents who have been granted pre-settled status. That isn't great. Most of the time it's because they've misunderstood the step where it says you can have pre-settled status unless you want to upload evidence, and they haven't uploaded evidence. When you're talking to people, or you have people talking to them, make sure that they understand that they need to take that seriously and take the time to photograph evidence and provide it. Just in terms of documents, this is more of a desk note, I'm going to be quite quick. But essentially, for most people, it will be enough to have your phone, your passport, and your national insurance number. Of course, the Home Office got in trouble for saying that that's all you need. For some Europeans, they will also, as I say, need to provide evidence, and that will tend to be P60s, annual bank statements, utility bills, maybe a letter from an employer, so get ready to be asked for that letter. Their family members will need broadly the same information, but they will also need to prove that they are indeed a family member. So they'll need to show that they are married to a European, or they have been living together for 2 years in a relationship akin to marriage. Children will need birth certificates and so on. In terms of family members, so essentially, if there is a deal, family members who are related to a European before the end of December 2020 will be able to benefit from the same settled status scheme. If they become related after the 1st of January 2021, they will enter under the immigration rules. That will typically mean where somebody has got married or they began a relationship and have been living together for 2 years after the beginning of 2021. If they come under the immigration rules, there will be a minimum earnings that the European will need to provide, normally about £18,500. Any children born after at the end of December 2020 will benefit from this scheme, though. They're born to the European. If there is no deal, it's broadly the same. The main point to understand that's different is that whereas under a deal, this is available to family members before the end of 2020, under a no deal, it will be available to existing family members up until the end of October 2019 or whenever Brexit happens. Family members are a bit more complicated. That's where people do tend to seek a bit of advice because, not least apart from anything else, it can make people anxious because the immigration rules aren't always as friendly as some people might like to family members. So when I started talking about Brexit 3 years ago, I thought the most important thing was all of my wonderful political insights. It isn't, and actually you can get probably better quality from the BBC than my insights on politics. But actually for HR people, often the most important thing is, yeah, that's all great, but who can we employ and what do we need to see? So I've tried to put that together in one slide, which we can see at the screen at the moment, and will be, I hope, a useful desk note for you afterwards. But essentially, if there is a deal, your job on right to work will not change until the 1st of January 2021. For European nationals coming in until the end of December 2020, they will need to be Europeans. You will need to be able to see that they have a passport or an ID card. And you will need to, and you will ought to be advising them to apply for pre-settled or settled status. From the beginning of 2021, you will not need to repeat right-to-work checks on employees who are already in your employment before, where you've conducted the existing right to work check. But for new employees, you will need to see that they've got the right to work here. That will mean pre-settled status, settled status, or a work visa where they are Europeans. Under no deal, again, actually, as complicated as it all may feel and uncertain, actually nothing really changes until the end of December 2020. When you're checking right to work for European nationals, you'll want to make sure that they're European with an ID card or a European passport. You should be encouraging them to make an application for pre-settled or settled status if they were here before Brexit. You should be encouraging European temporary leave to remain if they'll stay beyond the 1st of January 2021, but the right to work check doesn't change. It does change, though, on the 1st of January 2021, where you will need to see, again, either a work permit or a settled or pre-settled status, or after a no deal, European temporary leave to remain. So the picture that I've drawn on there, I think it sets it out quite clearly, and hopefully will be a useful thing for you to pull out the pack and send over to recruiters, because I know how important it is to them. And then just to finish off, I'm going to talk about the immigration white paper, which is basically about the new immigration system that will apply from the 1st of January 2021. Now, there's a caveat here. What I will talk about is a policy that was published when Theresa May was Prime Minister. We understand that the broad thrust of what I talk about now will still be the case and is still planned to be the case. But you may have seen that Boris Johnson has asked the Migration Advisory Committee, his Home Secretary Priti Patel has written a letter saying, how can we firstly look at whether or not the salaries that we were considering previously are too high, and I'll come to that, but also how can we have an Australian-style points-based system or learn from other countries in the UK. The Australian system, we actually implemented it when I worked for the Home Office 10 years ago and got rid of the Australian bits of the points-based system because they didn't work particularly well for the UK. But if there are elements that they can learn from, and the Australian system does have a reasonable framework, then through the CIPD, I'm sure briefing will go out explaining what that means for you. And of course, we will check out our Brexit microsite. We'll be putting things on there. For now, though, what you need to understand is that from the 1st of January 2021, the top line is that for all nationalities, there will be a single immigration system, albeit Irish will not fall under that system, and of course neither will UK nationals, but there will be some flexibility for certain nationalities within that system where they get it a little bit easier. And that will probably be richer, more economically developed countries and countries where we've wanted to strike a big trade deal. For instance, the BRIC countries, I can see India and China having a mobility of people pretty high on their wish list for a trade agreement. If you are familiar with Tier 2 of the points-based system, for skilled workers, the system will be pretty similar. You will need to sponsor people. They will need to be doing a skilled job, which will be set at A-level. They will need to be paid a minimum salary, which could be £30,000, but the Home Office is looking at it if it can be lower. However, it will be better than what we have at the moment for employers. There won't be a cap on numbers, so there won't be the delay or uncertainty that comes with that, and you won't need to advertise the job for a resident labour market test as you do at the moment. Whereas now, if we were recruiting somebody into a permanent role from outside of the EU, I'd be advising a 3 to 4, maybe 5 month leading time. We're expecting it to take about 3 weeks, which is pretty good for a new hire compared to most countries in the world. It's not as good as free movement for employers, it's not as quick as flexible, but it feels like 3 weeks is workable. However, it will be expensive. Current government fees will apply, and if you're sponsoring somebody for a single person for 3 years, you're looking at about $4,500 just in government fees if you're a larger employer, probably $2,500 to $3,500 if you are a smaller employer just for legal fees. If you are sponsoring somebody for 5 years and they have a partner and 3 family members, that's going to be about £21,000 for a big employer just in government fees. I mean, that's a hefty sum. So your business will need to understand what that means. I've been talking there about higher skilled workers. For lower skilled workers, the really important thing is, and it's interesting, we've talked about this a lot on our roadshow with Gerwyn. If you're recruiting to a lower skilled job, assume that they will be limited to 1 year for a short-term visa category, and the nationality that they will be, the countries that they can come through will be limited to countries most likely better off, more economically developed countries where they pose a lower immigration risk, and as I say, those that we have a trade agreement with. However, there will also be a youth mobility scheme, most likely available to all European countries and already available to New Zealand, Canada, Monaco, strangely, is on there, South Korea, Australia is on there, and a few other countries. That youth mobility scheme will probably be capped, but it will mean that people aged 18 to 30 will be able to come over here and take whatever work that they want, just as our young people can go over to those countries. There is an open question about whether or not they will be able to stay and move into a work category at the end of the youth mobility visa. We won't get an answer to that probably until the new year, but it will be an option. Gerwyn and the CIPD find it easier to get into government than anyone, and one of the top lines is, let's make it 2 years for everyone, which we think is probably right, because I don't know what I could do with a new employee over the course of a year, especially in a more junior role, because you need time to teach them. You want them to be able to settle in and integrate, and you don't want the churn that could come with short-term work, and frankly, it would hit our culture. Aside from anything else.
Just a quick sentence on that, Ian. Again, the focus groups that we've both been involved in has highlighted how relatively unaware employers are of that youth mobility scheme route, and to stress the point that EU citizens ages 18 to 30 do not require a job offer to come into the UK. So it's a very fluid way of trying to get unskilled labour in particular into the UK to circumvent the formal points-based system.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so the next slide just contains some of... So I keep talking about jobs at A-level skill, and I say it like I know, like it's a really obvious measure. It isn't, obviously. So I've included on this slide a few examples of jobs that are or are not going to meet the skills level. So we have 3 categories on there. This is indicative. If you wanted to see the full list, I would Google Home Office Codes of Practice, and that will bring up all of the jobs and show you where peak jobs are considered to be sufficiently skilled. But the green column are jobs that are considered to be at degree level, where they will probably be paid over £30,000 or are close enough that most employers will be able to increase salaries. Then the amber rating jobs are jobs in manufacturing and IT and technology, which would be sufficiently skilled but are not typically paid £30,000. And what you need to be thinking about here is, are we going to need to increase wages? Is it just for Europeans? Is it for everybody? Could we get away with only paying our European workers more? Or do we need to think about a different way to do the job? Then we have a list of jobs considered to be lower skilled. I'm always surprised by credit controllers, because that's a hard job, I find, when I work with our credit controllers. But credit controllers, chemical operative, plasterers, bar staff, care workers, right now, those people would not qualify for a skilled work visa and will be limited to 1 or maybe 2 years. So thinking about that and how all of this fits together, essentially what we have now is free movement for Europeans. They can do whatever they like. Non-Europeans are limited to skilled worker visas and cannot come in otherwise. But from 2021, like the way to conceive it is, if you are considering employing people in jobs that are considered skilled, A-level and above, they're going to be able to come in, potentially stay permanently, but they're going to need to speak English. They're probably going to need to meet a £30,000 minimum salary, maybe a little bit lower. You're going to have to pay the government fees, and you're going to have to sponsor them. Probably not through the sponsorship system that some of you will use at the moment, but a new interface that actually looks pretty good. If they are not skilled to A-level level, they're at best going to be limited to 2 years. But even then, they're going to need to be from certain countries and aged 18 to 30. Otherwise, they may be able to come in for a year, but they would be limited according to whether or not we have an agreement with those countries as to their lower skilled people coming in for that 12-month period. So it's going to be pretty uncertain. What we're saying to our clients is, have a look at your workforce, look at nationalities as far as you know it, and if you find pockets of Europeans in particular jobs, ask yourself, are we recruiting Europeans into those jobs because they have specific skills? Are we recruiting them because we can't find British labour to do those jobs? Or is it just because we interviewed and they were nice and good and we thought they'd fit in? If it's the latter, maybe it's manageable. If it's the former, have a look at it and work out, for those jobs, will they qualify for a work permit in future? How long can they stay for? How much is it going to cost us? What does it mean in terms of salary? And what does the business need to understand and think about in terms of recruitment policies and future, and in terms of where the work is done in the UK or in the world, and other considerations? So to finish off, though, so I've said so much there, and I hope it was clear. It's hard with Brexit to say very little, but it's always hard to cover everything. So what I've done on this final slide is set out how I think about a plan for Brexit. So it's all really hard, but it is possible, and lots of our clients have plans in place to mitigate these risks and contingencies for afterwards. And there are 3 broad ways to bucket your plan. Before you get there, just plot out, using the 2 slides where I have dates, plot out the key milestones and use them as your anchors for when you need to take action. Firstly, then, think about communications, and communication starts with reassuring people that you will not need to leave the country that you're in because of Brexit, but you will need to make an application. Do that now if you haven't already, and make sure that they understand what they will need to do. Then it's about educating people, and as we get closer to Brexit, probably if you haven't already, do it now or a few days before or after the end of October. Say, again, you're not going to need to leave, but you're going to need to make an application, and this is how. And then be more directive as you're approaching deadlines and say, have you made the application? Because if not, you're going to find it a lot harder to rent a car, get a job, maybe access medical treatment. You, in theory, could become an illegal migrant in the UK if you don't make an application on time. Get the applications in, and as you're approaching deadlines, get that bit more directive. For British people in Europe, do that little bit more and make sure that they know that they need to register and that you'll be back in touch when policies become clearer as to how. And then for the business, make sure that they know, particularly for a no-deal Brexit, that they need to begin thinking now about how long people will be able to stay in the UK through European temporary leave to remain, and the fact that in Europe, European nationals will need, British nationals will need a work permit. Make sure that they know that it's hard, takes time, and there'll be a cost associated, and that they know early so that they don't find out at the last minute and they aren't best pleased with that. And then finally, possibly less of a priority but still important, plot out who your European workers are in the UK, whether or not they are business critical as a nationality in particular jobs, and whether or not they will qualify, how long it will take to get them in, and what it will cost. So that all sounds huge, but actually it's probably no bigger a job than when I remember listening to CIPD webinars on GDPR. As long as you know your stuff and what's needed, it's actually entirely manageable. So I'll stop there. I managed to do it 2 minutes quicker than the last webinar, but 3 minutes quicker than I promised. So I'll pass to Gerwyn.
Thank you, Ian. Just to wrap up with some next steps, and it's very timely, this webinar, because tomorrow we're launching our report, and as Ian hinted, we are putting forward a series of policy recommendations to government as part of our response to the white paper, and there are a couple of flagship recommendations that we've got in there, the main one being arguably the 2-year temporary mobility scheme that essentially is a youth mobility scheme for people of all ages. And I think it could be really useful for various reasons. One, it's fairer, so it doesn't discriminate by age. It's not restricted to people aged 18 to 30. It also is cheaper for employers because it allows organisations to get around the points-based system in terms of not requiring the EU nationals they employ to have a job offer. And lastly, it's simpler. We know how complex the system is for employers and how daunted they feel by it. So I think the onus is on government to try and make the system as simple as possible. What we're suggesting is an effective merging of two routes, which I think we can ease some confusion. So in terms of questions, Ian, I've put together a couple of questions that have been frequently asked, one of which is around cost. So I think the question is twofold. One is what is the full range of costs, so including the likes of the skills surcharge and health surcharge, and what is the split between employer and employee effectively?
Yeah, so the costs are, so firstly, a visa will typically cost, a work visa will typically cost about £600 for 3 years, about £1,100 or £1,200 for 5 years. You then have a cost for a certificate of sponsorship, which is £199. You have a immigration skills charge, which is about £360 a year for a smaller employer, £1,000 per year for a larger employer, and that's only attached to the skilled worker. And then you have an immigration skills charge, which is typically £400 per year. How this pans out is, to be honest, most of our clients pay for this for all of it for their employees. They don't tend to pass on the cost. Many of our clients also cover the cost for dependents of family members of employees as well. But the way strictly to think about it is the visa cost for the worker and their family members would be borne by the family member. The immigration health surcharge would also be borne by the worker and their family members. And then the certificate of sponsorship and the skills charge would be borne by the employer. As I say, though, different companies approach it differently.
And how can employers check that the EU citizens they employ have got either settled status or pre-settled status?
So there are two considerations here. Firstly, you do not need to check. So it is enough to know up until the end of December 2020 that they're European. You don't need to check that they've made an application. But that said, I do speak to quite a lot of clients who want to check, and they want to check for the good of their employees to make sure that people don't find themselves not applying and here illegally. Some of our clients are just asking for screenshots. Others are asking for the reference number that allows them to then are asking for permission to check them online through the Home Office Right to Work portal, and that normally means the European going in and giving permission to the employer using an email address to say yes, Gerwyn can take a look at this. Just one consideration here, though, which I can't talk to in detail, but I can warn of. Many of our clients consider this to be compliant with GDPR, data privacy rules and employment rules, but we also have clients who are nervous about it. Please, before you do that, given that you have no legal duty to collect this information, that you speak to relevant experts to make sure that they take the view that you're allowed to. The same is also true for one of my clients last night emailed me and asked, can they start collecting it from potential recruits? Again, I can see why they want to. My instinct is wait until they're an actual recruit rather than a prospect, but speak to a data privacy lawyer about that.
We've seen a recent spike in the number of EU citizens that have applied for settled status, partly, I'm sure, because of the comments from the Minister. And a couple of the questions are, can we afford to be patient and wait until the end of December 2020 or indeed June 2021 to register for the EU settlement scheme, or is there a need to do it earlier?
So I don't see typically any need to wait. My own view is get it done, and I say that partly because I'm somebody who, when Nicola needed the slides for this presentation, she actually got them a week late, but normally it would be 2 minutes before the deadline, and I leave everything to the last moment. I feel like this is too important, though. It's a person's residence. I feel like for a person's own self-assurance that it's better to have it so that they know that they have the right to stay here. That said, there may be some circumstances where it's better for a person to wait. So I touched very briefly on absences earlier, but typically for the 5-year residence, you can only have been absent from the UK for a maximum of 6 months in any given year, although you are allowed to be absent for up to a year on one occasion if it's for a good and prescribed reason. So sickness, maternity, business are included in that list of good reasons. If you have an assignee who is going to be going on assignment for 6 months somewhere, it might make sense to wait before you make the application. But even then, you're tracking back how long you've been in the country rather than how long you've held the status. For European temporary leave to remain, I think it's better to make an application early. I think that partly because there will, assuming it's needed, partly because there will be a rush, I imagine, towards the end of December 2020 when a lot of people want to make the applications. But there may be some instances where you need to move quicker.
Speaking of European temporary leave to remain, we've been asked whether there are any visa or sponsorship requirements associated with that.
No, there aren't, and it would be a free application.
Okay, great. Well, just to say that that ends the presentation and questions. A couple of slides to finish off. Firstly, some of the latest developments can be seen on our Brexit Hub. It also includes the latest Brexit-related outputs, which I've mentioned, and we'll clearly put the report that we're about to publish tomorrow on there, alongside some of the workshops that we'll be running in London in the near future and across the UK in the medium term. So thank you very much indeed for listening. I'll now hand you over to Michelle to wrap up.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much. There's a lot to take in today, and I know a lot of you have been asking, Michelle, can we have the slides? Michelle, is there some materials to come? Absolutely, there are materials to come afterwards around some of those questions. I'm just going to ask our experts. Robert Jarvis had a question about the Brexit microsite details. So if you have that to hand, you might want to pop that link in the chat there for us. But I know that some of you haven't had your direct questions answered, but the workshops are there for you for those. It's a very specific, my employee has this passport, that passport, and so that's there for you. But in addition to that, do be aware that you will be sent materials beyond today, so look out for that in your emails. So thanks very much to our experts. Thanks very much to you for all of your conversations in the chat, and do look out for more CIPD webinars in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.